Today is a good day because the Samurai is finally out of the shop and we are ready to hit some trails. There is a ton of custom work that we have done to the Samurai. It's hard to summarize it in a sentence, but we have pushed it out to a 100-inch wheelbase. I've custom made a 4-link suspension in the rear, a 3-link suspension in the front. We're running Fox air shocks all around. We've got custom mounts for shocks, for our links. We've trussed the axles. We've put RCVs in it. We've added power steering. The list is honestly endless, and thankfully I have a ton of videos on the channel that you can tune into if you're curious in that content. And I think it's finally time that we put this thing through a field test. I hope you're as excited as I am because this is the episode that we knock fuel, brakes, and steering off the list and finally roll this thing out of the shop. We've got the fuel cell in the back of the Samurai right now. I put together this rear divider so we have a bit of separation between the cabin and the actual cargo space. My next step is to now figure out the fuel pump hanger. So I'm gonna use a bit of the pieces from the previous Samurai fuel tank. This is the pump that we have. I got this off Rock Auto. It's just from a fuel injected tracker. And I ended up chopping up the previous hanger that I have that actually holds this pump inside the tank. What we need to do is I measured the distance from the bottom of the fuel cell to the top of where the hanger is gonna mount. And that's about 13 3/4 of an inch. I'm gonna knock that down to 13.5. All we have to do is extend this by 4 inches. Time to mount this fuel cell in the back of the Samurai. There are a few off-the-shelf versions available from a few companies, but well, that's no fun. I need an Alpine Fab version. So that's what we're doing here. We're getting a custom mount going. I've done 2 of these already. These just came off the plasma table and I wire wheeled them. And this is essentially going to mate up to the side of the fuel cell. And then I cut out these top pieces and that's going to sit on top of the fuel cell. So it's kind of going to go together like this and it's going to clamp down and hold that right in the back of the cargo area. Coming out of the fuel cell, I have a mixture of some -6 braided steel line, and I also have some EFI fuel injection hose. And to run that from the fuel cell up to the engine, what I decided to do is just knock 3 holes into the cargo area, and then I'm using some of these 1/2-inch just rubber grommets. So I've drilled those out with a step drill. Now they can just pop in nice and easily. And that's going to provide just a little bit of abrasion resistance. All I have to do is drop the fuel cell in, and then these are the front ones. Hey guys, how's it going? You know, I really appreciate your support because these videos take a lot of work on top of an already pretty big project to build in the Samurai. Honestly, it means a lot. And you all know how YouTube works. If you hit that like button, if you subscribe, if you keep watching this, maybe refer it to a friend, that helps me out a lot. All I'm really saying is I do appreciate you being here. It definitely does show me that support. Do me a favor and hit that button. The other piece to this fuel cell puzzle is the fuel pump. Essentially what I did is I took the mounting cap off the RCI. I drilled 3 holes into it and opened them up for bulkhead connectors. We have 2 for electrical and 1 for the fuel sending. So this is actually the pressurized fuel. That's coming right off the pump, and then I'm just using the factory connector spliced out to these electrical bulkheads, and that's going to give me the contacts up on the top that I can then run to the Samurai harness. So this is the rollover vent on the fuel cell. I have this coming through a check valve, which is supplied through RCI. I'm just running some regular 5/16 fuel hose. That comes essentially out of this vent. It runs along the back, the side, the front, the side again, around half the back, and then that goes down to the grommet that we previously installed. And then it's just poking out about 12 inches out the bottom. The reason it does that huge loop, something I didn't create, just learning through buggy forums and YouTube, but that just allows always to have the air pocket on the high side. So if you ever tip side to side or you roll over, you always have a section of your vent that is above your fuel, which means that you have an air pocket above and you won't get any fuel leaking out your vent. I have officially made my first AN line. So I basically had the 20-foot length of AN braided steel line. Gets pretty messy pretty quick, so you definitely have to take your time. You can see the ends up frayed quite a bit. My way of cutting this, just from learning online, I wrapped up with tape and I used a metal cutoff wheel and cut through. If it frays out crazy like this, I basically just taped it up again and redid another cut. It's a bit of a test of your patience, because if it frays out like this, you either have to redo the cut and try to get a better result, or you need to cram all of this in to the end of the AN fitting. Now we get to put this thing together. So I have the 90-degree fitting that comes right off the tank. What's really nice is that there's swivel connections, so I can just tighten this down into the position that I need. And then I decided to run a short little stubby line here because I have a fuel filter. So this is an inline fuel filter that I want to run on top of the tank. So I'm always going to carry a spare with me. And for whatever reason, if this thing clogs, then I can do a pretty quick changeout. So that's what goes on next, is the -6 fitting for the fuel line. And this is like, I know hose clamps are easy, but once this line is made, this is just so satisfying. So I basically have to do 4 more of these, I think. I hope. And just like that, we now have our AN line and AN fittings done and ready for the engine bay. In my hands here, the supply line, which is this big zip tie, because I'll easily forget. I put another one on the supply on the tank side. So 1/4 inches for the fuel supply, that's going to be the pressure coming off the pump, and the 5/16 is our return coming out of the engine bay. For all the brake lines, I ended up going with a full custom route. So I tore out all of the old Samurai lines. I bought a fresh 25-foot coil off of Amazon, and a buddy lent me a fancy tool, and I just got to work on doing this. This is my first time. After a few bends and after a few flares, makes a lot of sense and it's not too bad. I ended up actually running the brake lines on the opposite side of factory. So on the passenger side, we have our fuel. On the driver side, I have the brake lines coming up. It was just easier that way because the master was here. I had room with the links and it worked out really well. So we have all the brake lines running on the upper links to keep them out of the way of rocks. I have all the soft flex hoses coming off of just your factory Toyota, a specialty Rock Auto order. And the prop valve uses bubble flares. Everything else is using double inverted flares, and it's all M10. So I feel pretty good about that. I just need to now do the proper bleed of everything, make sure I have no leaks because it is my first time. But other than that, I really like the routing of it. It's clean. I know where things are. And if we have any breakages on the trail, I did pick up a few extra spares, so I'm gonna keep those in the toolbox. If we tear one of the soft lines on a stick or a root or wherever it might be, I have a few spares of those to fix on the trail. So as you already know, on the rear, I swapped out my stock drum brakes to some calipers and rotors. So going with four-wheel discs, one thing that's pretty important to have is a prop valve or proportioning valve. So I went with a Willwood one. That was just basically a purchase off Amazon. They have an M10 bubble flare proportioning valve that's really nice and compact. So I ended up throwing that right at my master cylinder location. For the master cylinder, I went with a Subaru master cylinder. I don't know exactly which car it is. I think it was from a Legacy, a Subaru Legacy. I'll have to maybe throw the details in the comments if you're interested, let me know. But it's a pretty common Samurai swap. This is a master cylinder that increases the bore size and will bolt up factory to the booster on the Samurai. So that makes my life pretty easy in terms of upgrading for the rear discs by getting more braking power and then also having some control over how much braking power is going to the rear brakes through that proportioning valve. What's left, because I do have all these brake lines done already, which feels great, is just to build a quick little mount for the prop valve. Right now it's just free hanging on all the hard line, but I don't want that to happen because those will fatigue over time. And if I'm in here cranking it down or tuning it, I don't want to be bending up and fatiguing those lines. So just a really simple mount, no plasma table needed here. I just chopped it up out of some scrap steel, and that's just going to slide into the two bolt holes on the prop valve, and I'm going to weld it to the inner fender well of the Samurai, and that should be a really quick solution to get this mounted up and ready to hit the trail. Well, what's really exciting is I have the brakes complete. So these brakes had a lot of parts to them. I'm kind of Frankensteining a lot of things together. I've got Nissan Pathfinder calipers in the rear, Mitsubishi Montero rotors front and rear, and then we have 4Runner V6 calipers on the front. We have a Subaru Legacy master cylinder, and then we have a Willwood generic proportioning valve. And then I did a custom brake line run from front to back with 3/16 hard line and some Toyota flex lines because it's all M10x1. We do have some bubble flares, there's some inverted flares, it's a bit of mixture of everything. Tried to keep it as common as I could, but I had to do with what I had for products off the shelf. So that's super exciting. It's a big thing knocked off the list. I feel really good about that. And we really just need to start tidying up some of the small things, and we can get this thing moving out the shop and actually driving. You know, these have been really difficult to find. All it is a hose barb. Might look like something simple, something you see at the hardware store. It is a British pipe thread, and it's been very difficult to source one locally. Why do I even need these and why am I even talking about it? Well, this is what I use for the diff breather. So I thread this into the top of the axle housing where the stock breather is, and this basically acts as a spot for me to throw a hose on. I can run it up to the top of the undercarriage of the Samurai, and whenever I get underwater, then I know that I'm not going to be filling up my axle housing with water. I'm filling up my diff oil. Thank God I'm doing this right now and I didn't forget and remember after I've driven 100 feet down the road. But having this fill port here is going to save me from having to deal with these annoying squeeze bottles for gear oil. Normally you're jamming it in sideways, but today my life is a lot easier. For these moments, not having to deal with that annoying bottle, I think this is a pretty good win. So I'll be using a factory manifold, exhaust manifold. I have it chopped off pretty high up there, and then we're just running some simple 45 and 20 degree bends and just basically piecing together like small little chunk by chunk, modifying, coping, trying to get this thing to twist between the engine and the upper link. For me, it was definitely a challenge. I had hardly any room. Thankfully, the Samurai is very little and it's only 1.5 inch tube. So that 1.5 inch tube, there's 2 of them that go from the manifold and then down. I had a little wide pipe from the stock exhaust as well that I diverted them into a 2.25 inch section. But that took a lot of time. Basically small pieces like this, chopping them up, getting them to snake around that upper link, and try my best to make it happen. After a bunch of patience, we made it work. I think it's a pretty good solution. I really hope it doesn't rattle its way into anything, but it's fully mounted, it's fully sealed. We are gonna see how this goes. We're a little close to our brake lines, so I'm hoping that we don't have too much heat there. If there's any issues, I'm gonna put a little heat shield in, or maybe have to wrap it up. Well, I'm not sure if any of you out there use SolidWorks. It's kind of an alternative to Fusion 360, a bit more of the industry standard version for 3D modeling. I have a lot of experience with it and I absolutely love the tool. I think it's really, really powerful. Even just a hobby version is really good. But man, they do not time their system maintenance or their upgrades at a very good time. I seem to always be hitting those whenever I want to do a big build. So my next step that I had a bunch of momentum towards was getting the battery tray figured out. I want to build out this battery tray, get that battery installed in the Samurai, and that would let me turn the key on, get some power out to this fuel pump, and check if I have any leaks in my fittings. But since they're doing system maintenance, since they're doing a full refresh of their software, I have to uninstall it all, reinstall it. You know the drill. It's taken a while. Reception is not that good at the shop, so I'm delayed for probably at least a few hours. Thankfully, I keep a pretty big list. So I'm definitely a list person. I've got 3 lists over there. The first list is to get the first crank going on the Samurai. So the first time I turn this over and I hear that engine running. The next list is the first drive. So that's when I get out of the shop, we do a lap around the block, probably just on pavement, maybe a few little hills, but that's just basically getting it out, getting the tires moving, hitting the brakes, trying things out, and getting it outside of the shop for the first time in over a year. The final list is the first wheel. So that's the first time we hit a trail, we hit some obstacles, we get this thing in 4x4, and we test it out. I'm doing a lot of explaining, but I'm catching you up. Things are going on in my head and I'm catching you guys up and keeping you on board. this little strap here I had some fun with. Sometimes, I don't know, you gotta go off on a creative riff, but I had some offcuts. I saw something kind of come together in my head, and I probably spent way too much time on it, but last night I stayed at the shop longer and just kind of rallied out and had some fun with building this. I have got the battery mounted. So this feels very good to me. I end up just polishing it up. It's all just raw steel. The Alpine Fab logo is a little bit more polished than the others, and then just ran a strap of clear on it. So that will be the battery strap down. It's held in by 4 M6 bolts. So not super convenient to get them off, but hey, it's not that bad. 4 bolts and the battery comes out. I did want to have kind of like a fancy hook, but you can only spend so much time on a battery tray. I need to be getting on the trail. That's a passion project I can do in some weeknight in the future. I'm picking away at the engine right now. I don't have much to do for the engine, but one thing I do need to add is since I'm doing power steering, I need to swap out my belt. So the Toyota power steering runs on a V-belt. The Samurai setup runs all on serpentine. It's a bit of a pain to be able to find a serpentine pulley to go on that power steering pump. And honestly, there's another option that I just went with that made things a little bit easier. So I just ripped off the crank pulley or the balancer off the crank, and this is what we're throwing on instead. So I ordered this off of Low Range Off-Road. It basically swaps from having a serpentine inner and outer to having just a serpentine inner and then using a V-belt for the outer pulley. So what that lets me do is run the same stock belt I had before. So now I can just purpose this V-belt section for my power steering. The next step of power steering is going to be figuring out my lines. But basically there is a return line and a feed line. That feed line is going to be full pressure. That's it's running up to pretty much 1500 PSI, so it's got to be built properly. And then the low pressure line for return should be a lot easier. I think I can use a lot of the lines that I have off the truck. So 3 lines in total. The low pressure side being gearbox to reservoir and then reservoir to pump. And then the pump is a high pressure off to the box again. I probably won't run any cooling to start. If I have issues or if I want to do that in the future when I have some time, I'll get a little power steering cooler, throw that in front of the rad, and that will be everything. I'm trying out a new product, and that's this thread marking compound. So basically on everything that I'm torquing, I'm just running a bead of this stuff across the bolt, the nut, any washers, and then onto the mating surface. And that way, it's a really quick way for me to know that 1, I know I've torqued it, and 2, if it starts creeping or someone tries to tamper with it in any way, I can get a quick visual check that that bolt is not where it's supposed to be. So this is really going to help me speed up my pre-trip checks if I'm doing any of those, and really just have some more confidence into knowing things are tight and they're tight enough for what I need them to be. So what I'm going to do is just connect the battery terminals and we're going to prime the fuel system. So I want to make sure that my pump turns on because I added a new pump and new wiring there. And I want to make sure that we're actually getting fuel to the engine. And then I'm going to crank this thing. Well, that's not good. Couldn't help but remember a moment that I talked about prior. So 1/4 inches for the fuel supply, that's going to be the pressure coming off the pump. You're right, I had the return and the supply swapped. So the engine was getting no fuel, and that's the reason we didn't get a start. So thankfully that's a quick swap. You can't get too lucky on the first crank after a couple of years, but hey, at least it's an easy one. Swap those over, and I think we're ready to rock. Does the Samurai look a little bit different to you guys? Yeah, that's right, it's got some mud on it. I was able to take this out for a test run the other day, and let me tell you, it is a lot of fun to drive, maybe because it's been a year or so since I've actually driven it. But man, this new suspension is an entirely different vehicle, as I'm sure you can tell. So this thing is caked in mud, and that's because I keep getting stuck because I only have 2-wheel drive right now. So the front drive shaft, as you saw in some previous videos, we just tacked that together and did our best to balance it. What I need to do now is actually get a dial indicator on it, and then we're going to throw some final welds on the drive shaft so that we can get this 4-wheel drive working and properly use the Samurai. The challenges with that is I've actually had to lengthen this drive shaft. So I took a stock Toyota drive shaft, I chopped those yokes off, and I threw in a piece of Schedule 80 pipe onto that. So that's a pretty thick wall. It does match up kind of close to what the Toyota yokes are. Honestly, not enough because there's still a little bit of play from the outer diameter of the yoke to the inner diameter of Schedule 80. So it's not a very good fit, and it's a little bit of a pain to try to actually balance that and get it concentric where it's not going to give me any vibrations. Well, what's exciting is I'm out here driving around the Samurai, which is pretty wicked actually having this thing trail ready. We're just cruising around the shop. There's a few little trails that are beside the shop. Good news is that we are on dirt. It is moving, it's working, but as I frame that up, there is unfortunately some bad news. And that is that our power steering gearbox seems to be just an absolute leaking machine. It's just puking out ATF fluid right basically at the input shaft where your steering wheel is going to enter the gearbox, and it's just absolutely puking out ATF. So I tried actually doing a bit of a shortcut. Just gonna wheel up a little obstacle here while we're talking. I tried a bit of a shortcut. Here, I'll show you what I'm doing. I'm gonna climb up this little wall here. I got it in 4-wheel drive 4 low. This thing is very awesome. This is very, very good at wheeling. All right, so what I was saying is I picked up some of the Lucas power steering stop leak, which I've heard good things about the other products, and it's definitely a Band-Aid, but I thought I'd give it a shot because I don't really have some good options for the next step. And that's what we're unfortunately running with right now, is the stop leak in the system. And we clearly have not stopped the leak. So the unfortunate next step is for us to tear out this steering box, and we're going to replace that with a new one. The downside is that the new one is out of a newer generation IFS, and it's slightly different configuration, and we're gonna have to cut a bit of the Samurai to make it work. That amount of steering fluid on the shop floor is not normal, and we have tried to use this Lucas power steering stop and no improvements. So that's where we're gonna have to swap out to a different steering box, one that's not leaking, because I don't really want to be fully replacing that right now. Let me just close the shop doors because it's cold out. With that steering box leaking, we now need to get a replacement. I don't really want to do a seal kit right now because I really just want to get this on the trail and start wheeling it. And I'm thinking that if I rebuild that other box with a new seal kit, I can always drill and tap it for hydro at the same time. So in the meantime, if we can get a replacement, I got this from a buddy who has a bunch of local Toyota parts. And this is a newer generation IFS steering box. Well, you're probably thinking to yourself, if I have another IFS gearbox sitting right here, that's a pretty quick swap just to throw it into the Samurai. But you're unfortunately a little bit wrong. I am using the earlier generation steering pump on the Samurai, sorry, not pump, gearbox, and this is the newer generation. So for pickups and 4Runners, it's an 88 or 89 split, but the difference between them unfortunately impacts me. It doesn't really on other Toyota pickups, but for me it does. And because these input ports here, the return and the pressure line, as well as the length of this input shaft, are about an inch difference between this newer one and the older one. And I'll show you why that matters. So you can see my return and pressure line are coming in just in front of the grill. And I did that on purpose. I wanted this to be super clean. It was a great way to route those pressure lines, and it all worked out perfectly. But now with this no good box, I haven't been able to find a replacement of the earlier generation. So I don't think I have a choice. I think I got to move up to this newer model. What that means is I'm going to now have to chop up the grill of the Samurai a little bit. And I'm also going to have to shorten my steering shaft, which comes up from the dash and the steering wheel down to the input of this gearbox. So it's not just a direct bolt in. I'm gonna have to do a bit of work here, which isn't ideal, but that's okay. That's the way that it goes, and we're just shaking this thing out. There's gonna be quite a few other things that are going wrong on this, so just take it one step at a time, work through them, and we'll get out there. Just got this power steering box on the front, and honestly, it's not that bad. I am not too offended by it. I did have to cut out a bunch of the grill as you saw, but hey, it works, and it's not actually as atrocious as I thought it was gonna be. All we know is we now have a working box and we're ready to move on. Before I actually take this thing out on a day trip and get out in the woods, I think it's a smart decision to throw a winch on there. I've already got this winch sitting around from the Samurai in its prior life, and for me to get it on here, all I really need to do is build a winch plate. We're gonna build this out into a proper bumper in the future, so we only really need to add on to this after, but getting a piece of 1/4-inch steel down there with proper bolt holes for this winch mount, I think this is just a safe option, and if we get in a little bit of a pickle, then we can at least get ourselves out. I'm pretty happy with this setup. It's nothing fancy, and I do need to add a proper bumper and some tube work on here in the future, but at least this way I can tug myself or anyone else out of a tough situation and just have that little extra bit of recovery tooling.